Introduction to the Bennet family. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet live in the English countryside. They have 5 daughters: Jane, Elizabeth, also called Lizzie, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. Their mother, Mrs. Bennet, is very eager for her daughters to marry rich men. She thinks that if her daughters find good husbands, they will have a happy and secure future. Mr. Bennet is more relaxed, and he sometimes makes jokes about Mrs. Bennet's worries. He loves his daughters, but especially enjoys talking with Elizabeth because she is quick-witted and clever. Their home is called Longbourn, and it will belong to a distant relative, Mr. Collins, when Mr. Bennet dies, because of a legal rule about inheritance. This rule makes Mrs. Bennet nervous, and she wants to marry her daughters off as soon as possible. Arrival of Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. One day, news arrives that a rich young man named Mr. Bingley is renting a large house called Netherfield Park. Mrs. Bennet becomes excited because Mr. Bingley might be a suitable husband for one of her daughters. At a local ball, the Bennets meet Mr. Bingley. He is handsome, friendly, and cheerful. He dances with Jane Bennet most of the evening. Jane is beautiful, sweet, and gentle. Mr. Bingley's close friend, Mr. Darcy, also attends the ball. Mr. Darcy is tall, rich, and intelligent, but he appears proud and cold. Elizabeth hears Mr. Darcy call her not handsome enough to tempt me. She feels insulted and decides she does not like him. Meanwhile, Jane and Mr. Bingley seem to grow fond of each other. Jane and Elizabeth's growing friendship with Bingley and Darcy soon. Jane receives an invitation to visit Mr. Bingley's sisters at Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet wants Jane to go by horse in the rain, hoping she will get a little sick and have to stay with Mr. Bingley. Unfortunately, Jane becomes very ill from the rain and must stay there for days. Elizabeth, worried about Jane, walks through muddy fields to visit her sister. This surprises Mr. Bingley's sisters. They think Elizabeth's behavior is not very elegant. Mr. Darcy, however, begins to admire Elizabeth for her kindness to Jane and her lively personality. Still, Elizabeth believes Mr. Darcy is too proud, and she does not see his growing interest in her. Mr. Collins and his proposal. Mr. Collins, a distant cousin of the Bennet family, arrives at Longbourn for a visit. He is the man who will inherit Mr. Bennet's property one day. Mr. Collins is a clergyman and works for Lady Catherine de Bourgh, a wealthy noblewoman. He wants to find a wife among the Bennet sisters. He first sets his sights on Jane, but Mrs. Bennet tells him Jane is likely to become engaged to Mr. Bingley. So, he decides Elizabeth is the next best choice. Mr. Collins is very pompous and talks a lot about Lady Catherine. He proposes to Elizabeth, but she refuses him because she does not love him. She also finds him foolish and cannot imagine a happy marriage with him. Mrs. Bennet is upset that Elizabeth said no, but Mr. Bennet supports Elizabeth's decision. Soon after, Mr. Collins quickly proposes to Elizabeth's friend, Charlotte Lucas. She accepts Mr. Collins because she fears she may never receive another marriage offer. This news surprises Elizabeth, but she stays friends with Charlotte even though she does not understand Charlotte's choice. Mr. Wickham and the militia. Around this time, the militia, a temporary army group, arrives in the nearby town. One officer, Mr. George Wickham, catches Elizabeth's eye. He is charming and handsome, and he seems friendly. Wickham tells Elizabeth a sad story about Mr. Darcy. He says Mr. Darcy treated him unfairly and did not give him money that Mr. Darcy's late father promised. Elizabeth believes Wickham because she already thinks Mr. Darcy is proud and cruel. Wickham's stories make Elizabeth dislike Mr. Darcy more. However, Elizabeth does not know that Wickham's version of the story is incomplete. She also does not realize that Wickham often tries to impress young ladies for his own advantage. Bingley leaves. Netherfield. Jane is very happy with Mr. Bingley. She believes Mr. Bingley loves her. But suddenly, Mr. Bingley leaves Netherfield and goes to London. He does not say goodbye, and he does not write to Jane. Jane feels sad and confused. She goes to London to stay with relatives, hoping to see Mr. Bingley, but his sisters do not welcome her. Jane's letters to Elizabeth are full of disappointment. Elizabeth begins to suspect that Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley's sisters are keeping Mr. Bingley away from Jane. Elizabeth thinks they do not want a marriage between someone as wealthy as Mr. Bingley and a woman with fewer advantages like Jane. Elizabeth grows angrier with Mr. Darcy, believing he ruined Jane's chance at happiness. Elizabeth visits Charlotte and Lady Catherine. Elizabeth visits her friend Charlotte, who is now Mrs. Collins, in her new home. Mr. Collins is very proud of his position as a clergyman near Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine is Mr. Darcy's aunt. She is a rich and bossy woman who enjoys giving advice to everyone. Elizabeth finds her rude and overbearing, but she stays polite. One evening, Mr. Darcy arrives to visit Lady Catherine. He is surprised to see Elizabeth there. He tries to talk to her, and Elizabeth is curious but still believes he is cold and unkind. She also meets Colonel Fitzwilliam, Mr. Darcy's cousin, who treats her with respect. Colonel Fitzwilliam tells Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy recently saved a friend from an unwise match. Elizabeth realizes he might be talking about Mr. Bingley and Jane. This information confirms Elizabeth's anger toward Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy's first proposal and Elizabeth's refusal. One day, Mr. Darcy visits Elizabeth while she is alone. He confesses he loves her and asks her to marry him. However, he mentions that her lower social status and her embarrassing family are problems for him. Elizabeth feels insulted by his words. She is furious that he seems to look down on her and her family. She also blames him for separating Jane and Mr. Bingley. She rejects his proposal angrily. Darcy leaves but later gives Elizabeth a letter. In the letter, he explains that he believed Jane did not truly love Mr. Bingley. Mr. Darcy also tells Elizabeth the truth about Mr. Wickham. He gave Wickham money, but Wickham tried to run away with Darcy's young sister, Georgiana, for her fortune. Mr. Darcy ended that plan and saved his sister's reputation. Elizabeth is shocked. She realizes she judged Mr. Darcy unfairly. She begins to change her opinion of him, but she is sad that she refused him so harshly. Elizabeth's changing feelings. Elizabeth goes on a trip with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. They visit Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's grand estate. Elizabeth believes Mr. Darcy is in London, so she feels comfortable touring his famous house. However, Mr. Darcy arrives while Elizabeth is there. Instead of acting proud, he is polite and kind to Elizabeth and her relatives. He invites Mr. Gardiner to fish at his lake, and he introduces Elizabeth to his sister, Georgiana, who is shy but sweet. Elizabeth sees a new side of Mr. Darcy. She realizes he is a caring brother and a generous landlord. She begins to think she was wrong to judge him so quickly. She wonders if she might love him. Lydia's elopement with Wickham. Elizabeth's visit is cut short by alarming news from home. Her youngest sister, Lydia, has run away with Mr. Wickham. They are not married, and this is a scandal. The Bennet family is in great distress because if Lydia does not marry Wickham, her reputation and the family's reputation will be ruined. Elizabeth tells Mr. Darcy about Lydia's situation. She feels very embarrassed, thinking Mr. Darcy will despise her family. Mr. Darcy leaves quickly, and Elizabeth returns home. Everyone is upset. Mr. Bennet and Mr. Gardiner search for Lydia and Wickham. They finally discover them in London. Soon after, Mr. Gardiner announces that Wickham agrees to marry Lydia. Mrs. Bennet is happy that her daughter is saved from scandal, but Elizabeth wonders how Mr. Gardiner had enough money to make Wickham marry Lydia. Mr. Darcy's secret help. After Lydia returns home, she mentions that Mr. Darcy was at her wedding. Elizabeth realizes that Mr. Darcy quietly helped pay Wickham's debts. He convinced Wickham to marry Lydia. He did this to protect Elizabeth's family's reputation. Elizabeth is amazed by his generosity. She feels grateful and starts to see Mr. Darcy as a true gentleman with a good heart. At the same time, Jane is surprised and overjoyed when Mr. Bingley comes back to Netherfield. He proposes to Jane, and she says yes. This makes Mrs. Bennet extremely happy. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy's engagement lady, Catherine de Bourgh, hears rumors that Mr. Darcy might marry Elizabeth. Lady Catherine is angry because she wants Mr. Darcy to marry her own daughter. She visits Elizabeth at Longbourn and tries to force her to reject Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth refuses Lady Catherine's demands. Later, Mr. Darcy visits Elizabeth again. This time, he is more humble. He asks if her feelings have changed since his first proposal. Elizabeth admits she now respects and loves him. He proposes again, and she accepts. Mr. Bennet is surprised when Elizabeth tells him she wants to marry Mr. Darcy, but he believes Elizabeth truly cares for him. In the end, there is a double wedding. Jane marries Mr. Bingley, and Elizabeth marries Mr. Darcy. They begin happy lives together. Reflection on Pride and Prejudice. This novel is about love, marriage, family, and class differences in England in the early 19th century. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy learn not to judge each other too quickly. Elizabeth's prejudice against Darcy and Darcy's pride in his social status almost prevent their love. Through misunderstandings and personal growth, they become a loving couple. Jane and Mr. Bingley also show that kindness and gentle hearts can overcome outside influence. The Bennet family, with its worries and comical moments, adds humor to the story. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's different personalities highlight the importance of respect and understanding in a household. In the end, Jane Austen's famous novel shows that real love can triumph over pride, prejudice, and social obstacles. The story teaches us to look beyond first impressions and to understand people's true characters. Conclusion: Pride and Prejudice is a beloved novel by Jane Austen. It was first published in 1813, but it continues to charm readers today. Its characters are lively, and the central romance between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy is iconic in literature. The novel's wit and social commentary make it a favorite among many readers. Jane Austen shows us that true love often requires patience, understanding, and forgiveness. The novel ends happily, with the promise of joy for both couples, Elizabeth with Darcy and Jane with Bingley. Despite the problems they face, they learn valuable lessons about themselves and about each other. As a result, Pride and Prejudice remains one of the most popular and enduring novels in the English language.